On behalf of Liberation War Museum as one of its partners, I'd like to open this session this is the Global Virtual Conference on commemorating past genocides and learning to prevent atrocity crimes. So welcome to the conference. Myself, Pia Conradson from Asia Justice and Rights will be the moderator today, and I would like to thank you all for joining this session. So today we have a 1-hour discussion with 3 very distinguished speakers on addressing and preventing genocide, lessons on transitional justice from ASEAN. If we are on time, we will aim to have about 10 minutes towards the end, taking questions from anyone joining with us. And throughout the session, please do write your question, including the Q&A chat box. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief introduction of our guests. So our first panelist today is Patrick Burgess, an international rights expert.
Pia, I think your headphone jack is not pushed in properly, perhaps.
Okay, let me go a bit closer. I think my headphones are better. Okay, so Patrick was the senior member and acting principal member of the Australian Refugee Tribunal and director of human rights for 2 UN peacekeeping missions in Timor-Leste, and for 5 years was the Asia director for the International Centre for Transitional Justice. Our second panelist is Afridal Dami, the chairperson of the Aceh Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thank you for being here today. He has served as the director of the board of the NGO Coalition for Human Rights and of Contrast Aceh. In 2001 to 2008, Afridal had drafted many bills concerning grassroots advocacy, children protection, and local election in transitional Aceh. Our third and final panelist today is Professor Rufa Kagoko Gyam, who is the co-convener of the Independent Working Group on Transitional Justice Dealing with the Past. Professor Rufa is the first Muslim and woman editor of the Mindanao Cross, a community paper published in Cotabato City since 1948. She has also written for the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism and other pieces related to the Mindanao armed conflict and transitional justice. So to begin, I'd just like to say thank you all for being here today. It's great to see close friends' faces. And I'd like to address the first question to Patrick Burgess. Patrick, could you please share with us for the next 7 minutes or so, from your experience, what are the most important steps that can be taken to try to avoid mass crimes such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes from being committed in the future?
Thank you, Pia, and a big hello to Afridal and Professor Rufa. It's great to be here today. To try and answer that question in 7 minutes is quite a job. How do we stop mass crimes, genocide, the types of things that are happening right now in Myanmar, for example? So I'm just going to make some observations from my 25 years working on transitions, trying to draw out some of the key aspects that contribute to a recurrence of mass violations. And first of all, one of the things that is clear is that usually mass crimes don't take place once in one context. Most of the contexts, almost all of the contexts I work in, are a recurrent cycle of violations. You will find that in these contexts, mass crimes are committed, then there's a period of peace, and then there's more mass crimes, a period of peace. And so the root causes of what is driving those mass violations are still there. Often our mistake is that we look at the political context at the time that violence breaks out as if it's limited to those factors of that particular time period. But that's not logical when you look back through a transitional justice lens to decades of recurrent violations, it doesn't make sense that they have to come up again and again in different political contexts. So what are the root causes? And I'll just share with you, because time is very short, some of the most important factors. Can you still hear me? You can't hear me?
I can hear you, Patrick. I can hear you.
Okay. I'll continue then. Some of the most important factors are that impunity is a key element in almost every situation of mass crimes that I've worked on. This seduction that let's not hold people to account because they're important political actors and we need to have a period of security, actually, when we look at it, usually doesn't work. And if we have a look at the situation in Myanmar now and ask ourselves that question when the international community arrived just a decade ago and said, oh, let's not look at transitional justice, let's not look at accountability, democracy is too important. That really hasn't worked out. First of all, that encouraged the attacks on the Rohingya and now taking over the whole country. It's very easy to make comments in hindsight, but that issue of impunity is one which exists in almost all the situations of recurrent violations. A transitional justice lens helps us to look at the factors. And a big mistake that's often made is people thinking that transitional justice is just about those small number of international courts far away, very expensive, holding, very importantly, a number of national leaders and others to account. But some of the most important elements of transitional justice are that it looks through a lens at decades of mass violations, analyzes them, sees what's the patterns, who's responsible, and what are the lessons. Impunity is one of them. A second major lesson is that intolerance drives many situations of mass violations. An intolerance towards minority groups that grows, the minority groups become angry because they're not receiving equal treatment. They seek political ends, they fail. Some of the young men take up weapons, they try and fight for equality, and then when they attack, usually at police stations, the military will often intervene with massive force, killing, raping, and torturing, and then mass crimes are committed, and a conflict that's unable to stop is ignited. So we need to look at the truth. We need to hear the victims' voices, because these political decisions that allow mass crimes to be committed and soldiers to be sent to undertake work usually take place in smoky rooms far from the effects of what those orders are. The voices of the victims to actually say what happened, what was the suffering of a woman gang raped in a military headquarters month after month, or having their sons taken away in the middle of the night, never heard of again, beaten to death. That's the voice that will affect people. When we are divorced from the reality of the effects of those political decisions, it allows them to go on again. Time is short, but another one of the key lessons is to control those who we entrust with guns. In every society, we usually give legal right to hold guns to the military and the police. That places them in a position where we can't argue with them if we don't have guns. They have the ultimate authority in their hand. So how do we control that? Civilian oversight of the military, making sure that accountability for small crimes is strong so that it doesn't grow through impunity. We need to control those who have the guns, because when we look across the region, we see how many times it's the military and police who are involved in mass violations, often at the behest of cronies, political masters whose goals are very often mass theft of the nation's resources. They want to steal the oil, the gas, the forests, the money, give it to their families and their friends. How do they do that? They manipulate those who have the guns. So we need to recognize those factors. discrimination, impunity, non-control of the military and police as key elements all across the region in recurrent mass crimes. So we also need to realize that in every context where violations have taken place, human beings gather into groups to fight back, not fight, but to sympathize, to help, to drive for reforms. Victims organizations, human rights defenders, human rights groups, civil society groups are a key part on the ground in every one of those contexts. While the international community and the donors are spending billions of dollars in very important international justice mechanisms in Europe and elsewhere, those civil society organizations who are fighting those fights for justice, the truth, and victims' rights on the ground have nobody to support them. Governments are simply not going to support the organizations that are holding them to account for mass crimes. So when I hear from donors to say, oh, how can they become sustainable? It makes no sense. International donors who are interested in peace, stability, security need to support civil society organizations for the services, the essential services that they provide. So these are some of the lessons that I think out of the many, many lessons around how to break the cycles of violence, we need to look back over decades, as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission does, if it's well run. Learn the lessons of what's taken place and the root causes. We need to share that truth as widely as possible. Listen to the stories of victims in their own voices because they affect us. We need to take care to stop the intolerance when it starts, because when it deepens, it breeds conflict. We need to stop impunity and to control those who have the right to legally carry guns. There's some of the lessons from nearly 30 years of working in this area in a very short and small nutshell, and I'm happy to talk more about any of them. Thanks, Pia.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for those very timely reminders, especially in light of what's happening in Myanmar and the region at the moment, and lessons that can only be gained from working more than 2 decades in this region and on transitional justice. I'd like to direct the next question to Afridal, who is the chairperson of the Aceh Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Afridal, what is the link between seeking truth about the past violations and preventing a recurrence? Can you please share a bit about your experience on truth seeking? Hi, Afridal, you just on mute.
Here we go. Can you hear me now? Okay. To answer the question, it is, I think it's quite important to understand that in my experience, especially in Aceh, what proceed of the mass violation of human rights in Aceh is that it is a political dispute that then run with armed conflict. So behind that armed conflict that you can expect both parties will spend some lives because this war, right? They kill each other. Is that a mass number of group of civilians who become victims of these conflicts. So the importance of the truth seeking is that to bring this fact into the surface. Both parties will easily can say that they will hide the fact of the widespread violence by saying that yes, some people are dying, but this is just the impact of the war. So you can always expect some people will die in the war. Only after the truth seeking we can show the people that no, these thousand of people who are lost their life in the armed conflict is not party of the conflict. They're just civilians. So this is the important thing about the truth seeking, to uncover the truth and bring it in all of its ugliness into the face of the communities and human rights communities and mass populations. Um, that is the importance of the truth seeking. Otherwise, people will just see what happened in the area, like actually just a clean war and no human right abuse at all. And believe it or not, this is exactly what happened with the rest of the people in the rest of Indonesia. Even until today, when we travel outside of Aceh, there are still people who doesn't know that in Aceh there was at least 20,000 people die as a civilian, as a side effect of this armed conflict. I traveled to Malang and several city in Java, Jakarta, Bogor, etc. I sometimes talk with laymen and ask them, "Do you know anything about what happened in Aceh during the highest time of the conflict?" They said, "Well, I know that I hear that there are war there, but do you know that who died in Aceh is not only the insurgents or uh, the military?" They said, "Well, maybe one or two, but mostly are the parties of the armed conflict." So the truth seeking is to uncover this. There is lots civilians become uh, victims of the conflict. Um, they are not just collateral. In some cases, they are targets. They are deliberately being target to um, to weaken the enemies in their strategy. So this is the importance of to seeking my point of view, uh, to uncover the truth, and how then this used to prevent the recurrence in the future. Well, as a democratic and law-abiding and human right-abiding nations, we need to open other people's eyes that this is the thing that our state uh, conducted in our area. If they are not defend the civilian from these mass atrocities, then in one day it can come to them as well. So just as Patrick mentioned earlier, impunity and the lack of rule of law play a lot of role in this armed conflict, which means the lack of rule of law and the impunity that happened in Aceh during that time also take place in other part of the country. So if that happened in that another part of the country as well, then we have nothing to hold on to protect us against the atrocities that happened in Aceh, and then it will also take place in other part of the country as well. Um, I think there is. I just want to add another point to what the three factors that Patrick already mentioned. I already agree to all of the three of them. Is that in Aceh, what happened during that time is the lack of a peaceful uh, conflict resolution and dispute resolutions. If only at that time rule of law is established, and then there is some other way to discuss the difference between the parties of interest, I think no need of the war, no need of the armed conflict, because every political or any interest can be discussed and then being resolved in a peaceful manner. I I mean, in our lifetime, we can see this several times happens. How Czechia and Slovakia divide themselves peacefully. This is not small thing; it's big thing. How then the British join and exit from the European Union? This is also kind of big thing in our lifetime. We can witness, and it's supposed to be taken place inside a country like in Aceh or in East Papua or East Timor and Papua as well. If we have this kind of peaceful conflict or interest conflict resolution, then atrocities can be avoided. So I agree all of that to Patrick, and just want to add one more point.
Okay, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Bia.
your experience in on truth seeking in Aceh, and being able to also relate that to other current issues across the globe as well. So thank you very much. And the next question is for Professor Rufa, currently in Cotabato in the Philippines. Professor Rufa, why is the role of victims a key element in dealing with mass crimes and preventing recurrence? And how can we support the role of the victims?
Okay. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to all of you and to all the participants, all the attendees of this very significant webinar, at least for me and for those who are working in transitional justice. First of all, I think the role of the victim is central to any transitional justice process because, first of all, they're the ones who suffered inordinately after atrocities and other horrendous genocidal crimes are committed by the state. So, at the center of any process that will lead to sustainable peace should be programs to address the um, the demands of the victims for rationalized reparations package with its different forms, but also because victims, most of them, are not necessarily, as Afridal has said, they're not necessarily the soldiers who are fighting themselves, but they are members of the civilian communities. They are people who have never have participated in the decision to wage war. So, in other words, they are some kind of a collateral damage to any decision, the militaristic decision to wage a war against a certain group in any political context where there is contestation between a very oppressive state and groups that are being discriminated against and those who have been targeted as people who are contesting against the state. So these communities of victims really have to be taken care of in a program that will address their trauma, that will address all the other psychological effects on their being and on their families, the ones who survived uh, the war. So there should be it should be central in any process that will address how that will uh, include any kind of transitional justice processes. In terms of, in another point of view, victims can also be perpetrators because they don't stay put in one state because some victims try to wage revenge against those who have inflicted harm on them and their families. And but at the same time, it is also a recognition that human beings will really react to any stimulus whenever they are harmed. They will defend themselves. They will fight to the death or whatever it is, because that's their way of survival. So, and then many of those who get killed or victimized in a conflict, the soldiers, for example, they're just following the militaristic rule: obey before you question. That's the rule of the military. So they're just foot soldiers who are following the orders of their commanders. And many of them come to the war unprepared. Like what happened in Mindanao, there have been many incidences of armed encounters between the Philippine military agents and those of the rebel forces. And many of the soldiers get ambushed or get victimized because sometimes they are led to this war without being prepared for them. And so, in many cases, when they are not familiar with the terrain and the rebels are, of course, familiar, they get into a situation where it's easy for the rebel groups to ambush them at any point in the territory where they are fighting. So they are victims as well, but they are also victims of a social structure that is very hierarchical, like that of the military. And so their victimhood is layered, meaning they're victims as foot soldiers, they're victims as ordinary people made to carry out oppressive orders of the state. Um, for me, victims should be put in a situation. I mean, those who survive, victims who survive, should be allowed to go through a program that will empower them to demand for a reparations package, a demand for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or even a Truth Commission to start with, so that they will know who should be held accountable, the chief parties that should be held accountable in any atrocity. Secondly, they should be moving towards the state of being victims as passive, objects of pity by the state or by so that they're only given like token programs by the state. So they should be allowed to make decisions on how they will look at their development in the future, so that they can move from being victims to what one person in another webinar said, they can move from being victims to victors, to in order to transcend the state where they are in, to take hold of any decisions that are made for their welfare in the future, so that they can also contribute to enduring peace in their respective communities. So that is how I see uh, that people in both civil society and government can help increase the role of victims in any transitional justice program. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rifa, and also for providing us with that broader understanding of victims and touching on the important note that victims can be transformed as well from victims to victors. I like that. I wrote that down. I wanted to open up a question to all of the panelists. And that question is, what is the link between impunity and preventing genocide? And if you could give some very brief examples from your work, how impunity has contributed to mass crimes. But I'd also like for us to have the opportunity to continue this discussion with what's already been said, and invite you if you have any comments or reflections on what each other have said so far. So I'll start with Patrick.
Thank you, and thank you for Afridal and Rufa's excellent comments, which are making me think more. I think to start with, we need to have a think about what impunity means, and also what Afridal was talking about, the rule of law. What does it mean? We use these terms all the time. And the rule of law means that the law should be the ruler, not the king or the political party or the cronies or the companies, but the law. The law should be the ruler. Fair laws that apply equally to every person, whether the president, the king, the poorest farmer, a woman, an illiterate woman. The rule of law is what Afridal was saying would prevent a lot of conflict, and that's very true. And as he said, in combination with impunity, what is impunity and how does that work? And you think about, for example, a police officer who arrests someone, they take them into the cells, and they're lazy, they think somebody might have committed the crime. The easiest way is to beat them up until they confess. Then the policeman doesn't have to conduct an investigation. He doesn't have to go out, try and collect evidence, because he has a confession. So he beats him up. The next police officer comes, he knows that what happened, and nothing happened to the first one. So he says, that's an easy thing to do. So he beats up the next person. Soon, we know in countries across the region, torture in order to get confessions becomes routine, becomes the way that police operate in many places because of the impunity. In fact, torture is a terrible thing. Beating, hurting someone so they're in so much pain that they confess to something that they didn't do is a terrible thing. But it's accepted everywhere because of this impunity. Now, the same thing happens at much higher levels when countries' leaders order or allow crimes to take place and nothing happens to them. The next leader comes along and says, well, why don't I do that? I can enrich myself from the minerals, the jade, the forests, the fish, the tin. I can take all that money for me and my family. Nothing will happen to me. That's how impunity works. And that's why when we don't hold people to account, it creates more and more violations. But in political contexts, for those involved in negotiations, it's often very seductive to think, well, these leaders, now we have a chance for peace, we have a chance for democracy. If we bring these leaders to account or we don't accept what they've done, we won't be able to move forward. In many situations where that's happened, what we found is that with all of those people still in place, as in the same powerful positions, sooner or later they start the same things again, and the next cycle of violence takes place. So a transitional justice lens allows us and enables us not to look at the situation now, for example, in Myanmar, not looking at it since November, but to look deeply at the lessons over the last 50, 60 years and internationally. Look at what happened in November. They had elections in Myanmar. They had elections in the United States also. The President of the United States said, oh, I'm not going to accept the results. They cheated. Let's storm the Capitol, take over power. What happened in the same month? The Myanmar military also had an election. And they said exactly the same thing that President Trump said. You cheated in the election, we're going to take over. In East Timor, I spent 6 years. The ballot run by the United Nations showed 78.5% supported independence. The Indonesian military said, oh, we're not going to accept the results of the election. They burned 60,000 people's houses in 3 weeks with their militia groups. In Bangladesh, as where we are today, the 1971 violations took place after the election in which the pro-independence party won and the Pakistani army wouldn't accept it. So transitional justice allows us to look at these violations of the past and see how they're connected and what leads to mass violations. And impunity, allowing crimes to go unaccounted for, always leads to more crimes being committed. The future people, the future leaders looking and seeing that if they commit the same crimes, they're unlikely to be held to account. So that's time is short, but that's all I have to say within these 5 minutes.
Thank you, Patrick, for your insight on that question. And I'd like to invite Rufa or Afridal if you have any brief comments as well.
Okay. When I was leading the what we call the listening process to carry out the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission task of doing research in the communities to listen to the stories and narratives of people who were victimized by more than 20 years of martial law under former President Marcos. There was a very huge case of massacre, more than 2,000 people in a coastal community in Mindanao. It is in Palimbang, Sultan Kudarat. It's an example of how intolerance for a group that is what I call a visible minority in Mindanao, meaning the Muslims, because they are visible in the sense that there are markers. Like, for example, in myself, I'm wearing a hijab, so immediately they will see that I'm Muslim. So there's a high level of intolerance at that period of history in our history. Now there's more tolerance, but still the deep-seated animosities brought about by long years of colonial rule that instilled a negative image of the Muslims in Mindanao. Because Christianity is the dominant religion of the whole country, and Muslims constitute only 10% in the population. And in that community, they were a community of Muslim Maguindanao. The army military general at that time wanted to overtake the whole town because they were allegedly supporting the Moro National Liberation Front, which was the rebel group at that time, 1974. And so they started storming out the whole town, including its small communities, to the extent that most of the men had to be herded in a mosque in that area. And every day for 1 week, around 100 men were asked to go out, only to be shot up and to be buried in shallow graves that they themselves were asked to dig just before the shooting. So it happened for 1 whole week, and all the other members of the community had to run. The women were placed in trucks, and some children died along the way because of starvation and dehydration. And it originated on the concept that if we don't kill these people, the whole rebel movement will overtake the Philippine armed forces. So they have to be killed. So when there was a parish priest, a Catholic priest in a neighboring area, who tried to plead with the commander to stop the killings, but he said, "No, Father, these people are going to support the rebels, so they also ought to be decimated." So that's what I consider a very strong case for, maybe it's genocide on a local level, but really more than 2,000 people in that area died. And either through the direct shooting from the soldiers and from the starvation and dehydration that they suffered along the way when they were fleeing to safer places. So it's an example of how impunity can be a driver for mass atrocity, just like what happened in that year, 1974, September 24, 1974. And so there is a memorialization of that place now, but that was not the only case of massacre that happened during the dark years of martial law. As Patrika said, it is easy to use torture as a way of making people the succumb to the oppression of the state. But the worst thing that happened is that the one who ordered the massive atrocity during that year is now honored as the name of a military camp of the Philippine Army here in Cotabato. So we feel that, I mean, this is like history repeating itself, except that it's no longer the violent thing that is being hoisted upon us, but it's using the memories, the sad memories of that very gory incident to remind us that impunity is still alive until now. And we are also seeing that happen in Marawi, in the Marawi siege in 2017, when there was a high level of intolerance for people who, this is again a reverse kind of uh, was this prejudice, because it's the Muslim, extremist Muslim groups that had a prejudice on Christians living in the area. And so uh, I should say that if that intolerance should have been addressed earlier, then we would have prevented that that massive case of, you know, like a clash between the extremist groups and the Philippine government, which victimized also more than 2,000 people. And for now, it's very hard to identify who among the groups can be held accountable because there was no truth commission after that. So these are the examples when impunity can really drive genocidal acts by the state, so that it will really make people suffer inordinately after all this violence. And they suffer still because they are pushed more to lower levels of impoverishment, and also because there are no schools anymore, since the schools are destroyed or have been destroyed. So the victimization again is exacerbated by all these structural damage, and as well as the damage to the social relations between different diverse groups in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rifa. I'd like to hear from Afridal if you have any more examples or insights about this link between impunity and recurring genocide and preventing genocide.
Yeah, well, the issue of impunity has to be looked inside the country with presumably some system of administration of justice are still in place. Okay, so in a country where there is no administration of justice at all, we cannot apply impunity there, because of course if there is no law, then rule of law cannot be expected. So what happened in Aceh at the time was that Aceh as a part of Indonesia still has this administration of justice. But when come to the people with the gun, the crime system is stopped in contradicting them, just like what Patrick mentioned earlier. And can you imagine if these people with gun do the crime against the civilian? And when they can do it freely without accountability, and they can do whatever they want to do against anybody who can without power, then it's only about time before they can wipe out of all the population. So this is only a matter of time. So administration of justice and impunity and rule of law is lack at that time. I mean, impunity is rampant, and rule of law is nothing, nowhere to be seen. So, the rule of law, just like Patrick mentioned, is that the law is supposed to be above all, including the military and the police force. But when they can do everything without, accountability, then the rule of law is not there. And people sometimes just forget that we are one system in the whole country. What happened in Aceh at the time, in the exact real time, exact second and minutes and hour can also take place in another part of Indonesia because of impunity is just the same. I don't think that the president at the time will just give Aceh a certain special treatment, saying that, oh, from certain time to time, Aceh is free for everybody to be beaten. No, it is just at the time the lack of rule of law make the perpetrators can do everything they want freely. And I also want to mention something on the other side. I mean, the other side of the mirror as well. When we see all of these 5,000 cases that we already collected in the DRC, one will can wonder why there's nobody report to the police, or why nobody report to, let's say, military police at that time. So, and believe it or not, there is a time under the time of our uh, uh, the period we are supposed to be investigate. I was work as a human rights lawyer, and in my limited capacity, I actually done just that. Every time somebody come to me saying that, please, sir, help me because my husband, my brother, or my father has been arrested last night, I try to use the uh, judicial system. I report the police, I report the military police to the military police, and some of them we have a good result. I mean, at least if they are, abducted or arrested without any information, we can dig them out of the darkness. You can find them somewhere, and then uh, the the crime is not become worse. No, become, if people are being abducted and illegally arrested, they can become killed or uh, enforced to disappearance. So once we use the rule of law to do just that, it stops. Of course, there is some in some cases where I fail, and just like we already mentioned, when they deny and rule of law is not being taken forward, and then people being killed or just disappear. Uh, Another thing is that during our work in the TRC, we try to collect uh, document uh, to try to understand what stage of the rule of law at the time in Aceh. Assuming that we have 5,000 cases of high crimes, that at least 10% of them known by the military police or by the police, and assuming that some number of that supposed to be come to the military court, what number come out as being perpetrators from military or police being punished? Not so much. So not so many. Only tens, not even reach to 50 cases being brought to justice. Only several. And the most famous in Aceh is the case of Butung Atuh or Tengku Bantakia, where an ulama with his pupil being shot down by a group of military. And this is the only case that famous in Aceh has taken care into justice, and we try to dig more, not so many. That's mean at the time uh, there's lack of will from the government side to withhold the criminal justice system, but it's also on the other hand, the people lost their. We don't blame them, yeah, right? We don't blame them because they lack of willingness, or I don't know. I don't want to say this courage or bravery, but they lack of what needs to be done to bring these crimes into justice. Well, sometimes I just, daydreaming. If only at that time we actually report more cases to the military police or to the police and bring more cases of crimes into justice, start, let's say, since 80s, maybe the number is not so high like this at the end of the day. So this is just to give you and the panel and the participants the idea how important is the rule of law in armed conflict, or how bad the impunity is a root cause of a problem that can end up into high number of crimes. It is just about time. I think if this keep going on, before some group will call his own group to commit genocide. That's like what we discussed today in this panel. Thank you, Via.
Thank you so much, Afridal. I think we have about 4 minutes left for a question. I see a question in the chat box, which Rufa has kindly replied to. The first question is, what are the challenges to establish a reparations process in the Asia context? I know that the Philippines had a very interesting reparations program, but I invite any of you just to give a very brief few sentence response if you would like to this question.
The question on reparations, Pia? Yeah.
The challenges for reparations.
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge for reparations is to do with funding. Number one, for governments to commit significant amounts of funding for reparations. But the second challenge is when you've had tens of thousands of killed, many more raped and tortured, it's quite an extensive process to register. You can get a list of the victims, verify who is a victim, decide what they should get, distribute that to those victims, and then very often the victims, their family might come and take the money anyway. So there's a lot of challenges. Because of that, in some contexts, we find that there are smarter ways of giving reparations. If we can get the government to commit, a small monthly pension may be a better way than a lump sum, for example. We might find that in communities that are badly affected by the conflict, building schools or building buildings that are dedicated to the heroes or the victims that were killed and suffered other violations also may help. Giving free education to the children of victims. Some of these ways of implementing reparations programs that are not as demanding in terms of administration, I think we need to look more at for the developing context, because often those obstacles are used as excuses to do nothing. There are difficulties, but we can always do something to help victims, I believe, and we need to look at those creative ways of doing it.
Thank you, Patrick. And I see in the comment that Professor Rufa raised a good point, is that before a reparations process can take place, there also needs to be a legitimate Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well, which we've heard of the many challenges of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions from different contexts today. So in the interest of time, I think I'd like to close the session now. 1 hour went very fast. And, despite coming from these different backgrounds from our panelists, these are all lessons that we can learn and take from across the region and even the globe. So thank you to the panelists and participants for joining this session today on the lessons learned from TJ in the ASEAN region. So thank you and goodbye.